The story of the Habsburgs begins quietly in the Alpine heartlands of medieval Europe, long before their name would become synonymous with imperial pomp, continental warfare, and a famously unfortunate chin. Their ascent from modest counts to rulers of half the known world happened gradually, as if history itself were sleepwalking toward their destiny. By the time the modern era dawned, the family had become the embodiment of monarchy, vast, ancient, and woven into nearly every political thread of Europe. It is soothing, in a way, to imagine how their fortune rested not on sudden conquests or violent revolutions, but on marriages. Marriage, for the Habsburgs, was not a matter of romance or chance. It was a deliberate political strategy, refined until it became almost an art form. A soft whisper of a proverb expressed this strategy perfectly: "Let others wage war, you, fortunate Austria, marry." And marry they did. They married with such persistence, such single-mindedness, that their dynasty grew into a sprawling map of alliances. But these unions, often between close relatives, produced a genetic legacy as recognizable as their coat of arms. The early modern Habsburgs ruled Spain, Austria, the Low Countries, parts of Italy, and much of Central Europe. The sun, quite literally, never set on their empire. For a time, they seemed like the fixed stars of European politics, eternally present, infinitely stable. If you lived in the 16th century, it might have felt as though the Habsburgs always had been and always would be. Their banners fluttered over New World colonies, their fleets sailed across distant oceans, and their armies guarded the borders of Christendom against the expanding Ottoman Empire. They were everywhere, a dynastic presence threaded through daily life. But the price of continuity was blood, specifically, the same blood passing repeatedly through generation after generation. To keep their territories consolidated, they preferred to marry within the family: cousins, uncles, nieces, aunts. Today we know the consequences, but in the past, it seemed sensible, even necessary. If a piece of land went to an outsider through marriage, it could unravel centuries of work. And so the Habsburgs kept their lands close and their gene pool closer. One of the clearest symbols of this was the jaw. The so-called Habsburg jaw, or mandibular prognathism, became more pronounced across the centuries until it took on a life of its own in historical memory. Portraits of kings and queens show the subtle evolution of this trait: a little protrusion here, a larger lower lip there, until eventually the chin jutted outward with unmistakable dominance. It became a physical hallmark of Europe's most powerful family, as recognizable as a royal seal. And it was no coincidence. Generations of close kin marriage had condensed the features of their lineage into a distinct and ever-intensifying form. Yet the Habsburgs were more than their genetics. They were statesmen, warriors, dreamers of empire, and above all, survivors. Through plagues, wars, religious upheaval, and shifting borders, the dynasty endured. Consider Charles V, ruler of the Holy Roman Empire and Spain, whose domains spanned continents. His reign was heavy with responsibility, too heavy perhaps, and by the end of his life he retired to a monastery, overwhelmed by the weight of ruling the world. His son, Philip II of Spain, inherited the mightiest global empire ever seen, although he carried within him the unmistakable features and frailties of his bloodline. Long nights of paperwork, the constant struggle to maintain order across oceans, and the rigid religious orthodoxy of the age seemed to reflect something deep within him: an unyielding, inward-turned nature. While Spain grappled with revolts and wars, the Austrian branch of the family dealt with its own challenges. The Ottoman Empire pressed on their borders, pushing ever westward. Yet Vienna held firm. Through long sieges and bitter winters, the Habsburgs remained. Their persistence became a defining feature of Central European history, and their name carried a gravity that shaped diplomacy for centuries. As time wore on, however, the signs of hereditary strain became impossible to ignore. Some children were born frail, others suffered cognitive or physical disabilities. The most famous example was Charles II of Spain, the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. His story feels almost tragic when told softly. Born in 1661, he carried generations of accumulated inbreeding in his body. His jaw was so pronounced he struggled to chew, his health was delicate from infancy, his education was limited, and though he was king, he was often more a symbol of royal continuity than an active ruler. In the court, everything swirled around him: ambition, intrigue, politics, but he moved through it like someone trapped under the weight of fate. His inability to produce an heir brought the dynasty to its breaking point. When he died in 1700, only 39 years old, he effectively closed the chapter on the Spanish Habsburgs, and the War of the Spanish Succession followed, a massive conflict that reshaped Europe. The Austrian line endured longer and arguably more successfully, but even there the shadows of the past lingered. Their empire, a patchwork of ethnic groups and languages, held together under the symbol of the double-headed eagle, stretched across the heart of the continent. For centuries it was one of Europe's great powers. Empress Maria Theresa, one of their most formidable rulers, bore 16 children, many of whom went on to occupy significant thrones. Among them was Marie Antoinette, whose fate is known to every student of French history. The empress herself worked tirelessly to reform her domains, modernizing legal systems, education, and administration, and her influence helped stabilize the family at a time when monarchies across Europe were beginning to tremble. Yet stability was always temporary. The 19th century brought nationalism, revolution, and an increasingly outdated imperial structure. The Habsburgs governed enormous populations that did not always wish to be unified under a single crown. Their world, one of powdered wigs, formal etiquette, and rigid hierarchy, was slowly dissolving into modernity. The final act of the dynasty came in the early 20th century, with the figure of Franz Joseph I, whose long reign spanned from the 1840s to the First World War. If you picture an elderly man with a white beard, impeccably dressed, standing solemnly beneath chandeliers in a palace of fading grandeur, you can almost sense the exhaustion of a monarchy trying to preserve itself in a world moving too fast. His nephew and heir, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in 1914, setting off the chain reaction that plunged Europe into war. Once the conflict ended, the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed, and with it fell the last great bastion of Habsburg rule. It is almost calming to think of the dynasty's end not as a dramatic failure, but as a gentle closing of a very long book. The family that once ruled vast territories had gradually become out of place in the modern world. Their decline was not sudden but slow, like the fading of a melody. After centuries of power built on marriages, traditions, and inheritance, the world had turned toward new ideas, nation-states, democracy, industrialization. The Habsburgs became part of history, a memory of how Europe once operated. Even after losing their throne, they retained a certain dignity. Living quietly in exile, the echo of their former greatness lingering in stories and architecture across the continent. When people think of the Habsburgs today, they often remember the famous chin first. It is a simple visual shorthand for generations of inbreeding, an illustration taught in classrooms, sometimes with an air of dark humor. But if one looks past that singular feature, the broader picture emerges, a family whose influence shaped centuries of European development. The inbreeding was real, of course, and its consequences profound, but it was just one part of a vast narrative that included exploration, warfare, culture, and politics. Their decisions, sometimes wise, sometimes short-sighted, helped shape borders, languages, laws, and traditions that persist to this day. Drifting into sleep, one might imagine the dynasty as a long tapestry, woven over centuries, the colors gradually fading as they near the end. The early brilliance of imperial expansion, the complex patterns of diplomatic marriages, the darker threads of genetic repetition, the turbulence of revolutions, and the quiet conclusion in the aftermath of World War I all blend together into a single, continuous piece. The Habsburgs ruled for almost a millennium. Their story is vast, intricate, and at times deeply strange, but above all it is enduring. And as the mind relaxes and the world grows softer, their tale becomes something gentle, a slow, winding river of history flowing through distant times, carrying with it empires, families, fortunes, and the peculiar legacy of the inbred royals who once shaped so much of Europe.